let's get into it. So I'm talking about quite the subject today. I'm going to get into family political divide. And the reason I'm talking about it is because I have lived a life of political divide. I am from a very conservative family. My parents, it's a military family, but also a religious family. And even on my extended family, most people are very conservative. And so I've dealt with this issue, for my entire life. When putting all my cards on the table now, I was, even when I'm Democrat, I'm probably a moderate Democrat, liberal leaning guy. And so when I visit my parents to this day, there's Fox News on 20 different TVs. And I see Jason joining here. But yeah, so the reason I'm talking about this subject is I want us to find ways to better get along with people of different political leanings. I want it to help us preserve our friendships and family relationships because they're very important. And as they've done numerous studies on happiness and wellness in later life, and much of it comes back to those connections that you have with people, and learning to preserve them is very important. So in addition to this, election season is upon us and tensions are high. We're seeing, I'm seeing more DMs about politics than ever before. I've seen several arguments break out between friends over the election. And yeah, I'm going to give you all some tools and some insights I've discovered. And I'll add a caveat to this before we even get into this presentation. I'm not here saying you should break bread with your white supremacist uncle. If there are people in your life who have deeply problematic views, you are not required to keep them in your life. You need to do what's best for you. But we're going to move, into the more gray area on the subject. So one of the things you can do that can help you deal with people with different views is to understand how political opinions form. And the big idea here, the thing I want to help us do is get away from this good versus evil thinking, get away from binary thinking, someone's a fascist, they're a racist, they're this, they're that. Try to think of it from the perspective of the formation of the views. So, for example, there's three main drivers of someone's political opinion. So one of them is political socialization. So where you grow up, the people you're surrounded with, the influential figures in your life will drive very often how, what you think about the world. I lived all over the country growing up. I lived in small towns in the South. I lived in big cities in the north. I lived on the West Coast, the East Coast. I lived in the Philippines. And from an early age, I saw how different people are. One study showed that there's the equivalent of like 7 or 8 different cultures in the United States, as in like different countries, basically. So you can expect this variability as you deal with people in the real world, and I'm sure you have. And this introduces the obvious question, why am I not conservative if my parents are? Well, the reason is, in part, I had teachers who I think were left-leaning. We celebrated Earth Day and did nature walks and all the, hippie, crunchy granola liberal things that we like to do. And perhaps that, was more influential on me. I don't know. But this introduces the second component of someone's political views. It's their embedded personality traits. So conservative people tend to favor order and predictability. Liberal people score higher on openness to new experience and tend to be more open-minded. So yeah, you can think of that when you're dealing with, some people this is just me speaking. I think some people are born on the path towards a certain political view from the get-go. I think it's just almost in their DNA, but your mileage may vary. So the third driver of political opinions is lived experiences. I had a boss at one of my last jobs. She was not very political at all, and I knew her outside of the office pretty well. But unfortunately, her grandmother and her mother were both shot in a mass shooting at the Philadelphia synagogue. And that profoundly changed how, she felt about the world, and she became much more political, and understandably so. So I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as you, deal with problematic people or people spouting off opinions that make you upset. Remember that there's a lot going on behind the curtains there. Maybe something happened to them in their life that brought them to that conclusion. It might just be their personality, and it could just be the way they were raised. Very often that's what it is too. My spouse is from an upstate New York family. They're all very liberal, and that's just the way they are and the way they see the world. So I wanted to pause and also remind you that your political views can make you very biased and almost irrational in many cases. There was a study utilizing a math test, and there's about 100 questions on this test. there was a control question and an experimental question. On the control question, it was just a straightforward math question. Many of the people taking this test were very high level mathematicians, including academics and professors. Most of them got the control question right. But then the test question came, the research question, and it was the same level of difficulty as that control question. And on this question, there was a political slant to it. And it dealt with crime statistics, gun violence, and the relation to gun laws. On this same question of the same level of difficulty, many of those same people got that question wrong, whereas they'd gotten the other one right. And it went directly to their political views. And because the question clashed with those views, it warped how they saw the question. And I'm being very intentional, not telling you which direction it slanted, because I'm trying to get you away from doing exactly that, thinking in that path. So remember this. More broadly, I would encourage you to harbor the possibility that you could be wrong about a certain situation or policy, so to speak. I would like to see people get away from having so much certainty about the world and what the solutions are. Everyone seems to have the answers these days. It's generally more complex than that. So let's get to the more personal stuff. I think it's fair to say a large number of you have family members whose political views might upset you or you just don't agree with. Remember that everyone has one in the family. That's what I always say. There's going to be someone at the family cookout who's going to have an opinion that's going to upset you, and this will be a family member that you have to see on a regular basis. You know they're going to be around again, and it probably isn't beneficial to you to get into a screaming match with them in that situation. And I'll give you a perfect recent example. So for context, I was a swimmer. I swam my whole life, swam through college. There was a swimmer named Ian Thorpe, who I'm sure many of you've heard of. He's an extremely famous Australian swimmer. He is an openly gay man, and he was in the closet for many years. He was asked about his sexuality as early as 13 and 14 years old, which was super inappropriate by journalists, but he lied about it and said he was not gay until he finally was able to in his 30s. So I watched him give a speech, and it was this very heartfelt talk about coming to terms with who he was and finding the courage to come out of the closet to his friends and family. So I had just watched this talk, and later that day I was at a family event, and I was talking to a cousin. And this cousin is 20 years older than me, and he was also a competitive swimmer. And I said to him, "Hey, by chance, do you remember Ian Thorpe?" And before I could say anything, he goes, "Oh yeah, but I didn't know he was gay." And he said it in this really derisive way. And I just kind of I was like, oh, never mind. And I realized I just didn't even want to tell the guy about the talk I'd listened to because we weren't going to be on the same page. And I just tried to push it out of my mind and move on with the conversation. Sometimes you have to make these calls when you're dealing with people. You have to realize who your audience is and pick your battles, so to speak. I wasn't, I could have made it a whole big thing, but I just didn't have the energy or desire to. So yeah, I can give you another example of a more mature way of dealing with it. I have two pairs of uncles and aunts. One uncle and aunt are very conservative, and they're from Jacksonville. The other uncle and aunt are from New Hampshire, and they're very liberal. So we had a couple years ago, we had a big Thanksgiving dinner, and we had probably 20 people at this really long table. And I noticed it was very interesting because those two pairs were sitting directly across from each other. And the conservative aunt from Jacksonville had a big cross necklace on. And the liberal aunt had a necklace with the shape of Africa on it because her and her husband had met in the Peace Corps while volunteering in Zimbabwe, which is the most liberal love story I've ever heard. But what was interesting was neither of them were talking about politics at the dinner table. And I knew just from knowing them that when you're alone with them, all they do is talk about politics. They're so political. They both fundraise. Yet at the table, they were having a completely cordial conversation and seemed to really like each other and get along. And it was kind of refreshing, actually. And I think that they probably subconsciously made, they knew it probably wouldn't benefit either of them to get into a political discussion. So I thought that was a mature path to take. And just, it's something to think about when you're dealing with family members who are pretty set in their ways and who are on the opposite side of the fence. You don't have to talk politics with them. Yeah, and also I would already a little low on time, so I'm going to try to get to the next slide here. And I would remind you too that even if you're upset about a family, let's say you have a close friend who has switched political sides, and now has problematic views. Like that's entirely normal too. People don't have the same political opinions their whole life. I have two close guy friends, really, and that's what I've got. And over 20 years, they have switched sides completely. One was a conservative. We lived in California. My roommate, he was a super conservative. He went to church by himself every Sunday. He voted against gay marriage. He was against legalization of marijuana, immigration. And my other friend was a climate activist. Today they've switched. The conservative guy lives in Toronto and he's more liberal than I am. And it's like really bewildering. The climate activist friend is now, he's into alt-right stuff and RFK Jr. and he loves to talk politics with me and drive me nuts and test me and push me on things. I still love him and I still want him in my life, but it's difficult sometimes. So keep in mind, these views can change. It's not the death of a friend every time. So let's say there's a political argument, or even just them pushing you to have a discussion about politics and they want to engage with you. There's a few things you can do. Adam Grant has an amazing book called Think Again, and it talks about changing someone's mind. And in it, there's a ton of insights from research on debate competitions. And one of the things top debaters do when they're having a debate is they open soft. They first acknowledge the things they agree with a person about, and they'll even compliment that person before getting into the weeds with them. And this is very beneficial because it builds cohesion and rapport with someone and reminds the two of you that you actually have more in common than you realize. And it's sort of like buffers the acceleration into like a thorny talk about abortion and things like that. So I would open soft if you do choose to engage with someone about a political topic. Don't feel the need to like ramp up the situation and go from 0 to 100. Yeah, and if things start to get a little heated, de-escalate the argument. Like you need to monitor your own mood and your own emotions in the situation. And if it feels like it's getting out of hand, let it go. I mean, I have a friend, John, who is conservative and he likes to talk politics, but he's so respectful about it. Like if I'll share an opinion, he will go, oh, interesting. And he's actually like very receptive. But a lot of people are not like that. So if it starts to get crazy, pump the brakes. There's a thing called Godwin's law, which is one of my favorite definitions. It states that the longer an argument goes, the likelihood of someone comparing their opponent to Hitler or Nazis approaches 100%. So just keep that in the back of your mind. It really applies to internet arguments more so, but I'm sure it can spill over into real life. And lastly, I would say if you are on the receiving end of abuse, and by abuse I mean someone raising their voice, you have full authority to cut the conversation off. Shouting and raising your voice is verbal abuse, full stop. Usually you can find out pretty quick how it's going to go with someone if they want to talk politics. So just keep that in mind. And remember, you don't have to be friends with every charlatan out there. But in closing, what I would say is the big idea here, like having friends and family with different political opinions is actually a good thing, I would argue. The world is becoming increasingly fragmented, as you know. People have sort of retreated into their own echo chambers, and it has really increased tensions between groups. There's a thing called contact hypothesis, which it's called a hypothesis, but it's supported by a lot of research, and it suggests that tensions between groups is reduced by bringing those groups together and having them interact with each other. And I think that's beneficial to people just in general, and to become a more well-rounded person, and challenge yourself to not just hang out with people you agree with, and see how other people see the world. I think for me, that's just something I learned from growing up in a military family and living in so many different places and always feeling like an outsider. Is it taught me to just be receptive to people and hear what they think and say, and not instantly jump to the conclusion that, this person was a bigot or this person's a fascist or whatever it may be. I try to at least hear people out and see how they came to those viewpoints. And more so learn to enjoy people, stay curious about them, ask them questions. And I would also encourage you to, get away from consuming content that you agree with. The internet and algorithms are designed to show you more of what you agree with. They're giant confirmation bias machines. And lastly, I would say, I know this is a big ask for a lot of you. Like some of you cannot stand certain political viewpoints and people who hold them. It's very hard. It can be very hard to get past the conclusions you draw about those people. So if you can't do this, I understand. But just remember the things I've talked about here. We want to Remember that political opinions, it's a complex process, the formation of them. They stay empathetic. Remember that sometimes people were just raised that way. Sometimes their personality traits have predisposed them to believe certain things. And then it's lived experiences. The life they have lived over the past decades will influence how they see the world. And you just have to respect that. Those are the main points I had. I will open up the floor to discussion, and yeah. Let me see if I can get this open here. Unfortunately, oh, here it is. Here we go. All right. Got a little chat going. Your reference of your father's military career and his support of Trump. I'm wondering if you find most military is the same. Is there a difference between officers and non-officers? Yeah. So my dad is a Republican, and I think he served in the administration as Undersecretary of Intelligence, and I think he likes Trump for, I don't want to say too much, but I think he likes Trump for what he does in terms of the platform, but I don't think he likes some of the antics and the conduct of Donald Trump. And yes, I do find most military people are conservative. I do know a few exceptions, actually a couple of admirals that are actually not. There's not really such thing. I've never heard of like a far left military person. There might be one or two out there, but it's not really a thing. But most, yeah, military, they come from, middle America. They tend to be conservative. Non-officers are, I would say, even more conservative. They're rural America, then enlisted. Let me pull up the chat. Oh my gosh, so many. Sorry, I have a little cough here. Okay. Let's see here. I'm gonna get through these. This is cool. I had to turn off the chat while I was talking because I was getting distracted. So I'm going to work my way through these really quick. Where's the line between letting things slide and speaking up? And I'm trying to get the chat open here 1 second. Aha. All right. Just scrolling up here. The chat's being weird. Okay, here we go. Looking at all these. Goodwin's Law. Did I say Godwin's? My bad. So what's the line between letting things slide for an easy life and speaking up and calling out racist, sexist comments? That's a good question. I think it's individual based, right? Like, I think that, I told the story about, my cousin. I don't have to, if it was my mom or dad who's saying that, I would probably say something more and try to pump the brakes a little bit on them, because it's, it's a little upsetting. I would probably be saying, what if you had a gay son? Da, da, da. But it's on an individual basis. I mean, people are complex, and yeah, I do think there comes a point where you have to call it out, of course, without ruining Thanksgiving, obviously. But yeah, there is a global rural-urban divide that's only growing. Yep, 100%. I have been consciously trying to craft blogs and tackle issues. Da, da, da. Yep. Good. Cool. These are all good points. I mean, yeah, it's this is a thorny subject, and I intentionally got into this one. I didn't want to do something kind of safe, and not all the questions have easy answers. As Ali mentioned, like figuring out how to deal with family who has problematic views, and I go through this constantly. Like I go home, and like I said, it's like my parents are so much more conservative than me, and they always talk politics too. Like they bring it up all the time, and like as a son, I don't want to like disappoint them, and like. So I try to just I have to really learn how to navigate the situation, because I know that they don't like some of my opinions, and I don't really want to get into it with them. But and they're kind of set in their ways. But the kind of cool thing is, though, I have had discussions with them about pretty thorny issues, and I feel like I have gotten through to them a little bit on a few things, because I think the problem with my parents is they just kind of consume the same type of media over and over again, which is kind of slanted. But yeah, I can say that I interact with people. I interact with tons of conservatives. I don't hate them. The people I love most in this world are conservative. So who else has questions here? Let's see. My father was very conservative, but also a rocket scientist. I would turn any of these conversations to logic. Yeah, that's a smart idea. Just going back to something that would appeal to someone who has a different, knowing their personality and making appeals to things that they believe strongly in, like appeals to ethics, logic, and norms of behavior, etc. So yeah, why are, that's true, but why are the problems now? Oh, that's a good question. Like, why are the problems now and not 30 to 40 years ago? I think it has to do with media consumption. We have 24-hour news cycles. And so like, so I'll give you an example. Like my friend I mentioned that's really into RFK Jr. and the alt-right stuff. What happened with him really is he got on YouTube, and it's because of influencers. And I recognize this is kind of hypocritical because I'm kind of an influencer too in my own little way. Influencers wanting clicks. So he follows some guy named Dave Smith, who is like an anti-vaxxer, and he watches he gets sucked in these wormholes, and he just stays in this like YouTube channels that are not, many of these YouTube channels are not like fact checked. And I recognize, I'm speaking from my own sort of bias here, but there's an avalanche of channels and social media sources that are not fact checked, and they have people that are just like former comedians who are talking about science and world issues as if they have a PhD in the subject, and they're good on their feet, they're very like articulate, and they have tons of followers, and it influences people. Part of the issue is that a YouTuber is still on a screen, and the mere fact of them being on a screen gives a sort of authority to them, like, oh, they're on TV, so they must be there for a reason. They must know what they're talking about. And a lot of people are naive. And I think this cuts both ways across parties. They fall for content that radicalizes them, and they've lost all sense of like grounding in what's the truth. And I don't like the fact that truth now is like watch CNN, watch Fox, and figure out the truth somewhere in between. It doesn't feel like it doesn't feel that easy to find out what the truth is. I do like watching BBC and like DW News and some of these other stations. They're not perfectly neutral, but they are more so than ours. Yeah. Okay. What about using frameworks like Five Whys? Yeah, that's a cool idea. No, that doesn't come off as liberal bullshit. The question was using frameworks like Five Whys to get people to really explain why they feel the way they do. Yeah, I mean, I don't see a problem with that. I was like, when I think about my friend who's like got the problematic views, one of the things I kind of concluded about him is that much of his conspiracy theories and the things that he believes, it's more about he has a very deep distrust of authority in general, and he doesn't like being told what to do by government agencies and things like that. And that's the underpinning, I think, for someone like him to have the views. And once I understood that, it helped sort of reduce my animosity towards him. So I think like the curiosity and dealing with them and like understanding like, why do they believe this? Like, how do they get to this point? Because there's usually a logical path that you can identify. So let's see here. How would you go about trying to persuade conservatives to vote for Kamala Harris? Are there any main points you could think to persuade them? Oh man, you're asking some good questions. That's a very hard one. I mean, I have in the conversations I've had, I have made my points. I don't like Trump. That's my bias. The points I've made with my conservative friends is that I don't think he'll leave office if he wins, and that he tried to overthrow an election. It didn't really work. They just said, well, what about this and the liberals and da da da. So it's like it's kind of like too late to convert many people. So yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. If you figure it out, please let me know. Um, yeah, no, it's messy. So let me scroll down here. The blind spot report, ground.news. Okay, I'll check that out. Bullying and gaslighting. Oh, so this is the other thing I would remind people too. Like, the internet is not a great place to have these discussions. Like, technically we're on the internet now, but I think you all know what I mean. And I've been publishing online for a long time. And, if you're going to have these conversations, it's generally better if you talk in person with someone who actually matters in your life. Don't lose your cool over a complete stranger. So I'm just reading your comments here. How do you have a conversation when you can agree on basic facts? Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, the starting point, I think people start from such opposite assumptions about the world. And again, I think a lot of it comes back to the media. Like, it's crazy how I see like the headlines that the people I know in when I know like what types of things they watch and consume, so many of them just literally are mirroring what they're shown on TV. They're literally paraphrasing the head stories on MSNBC and Fox. Like they're just sort of repeating what they see. And so it's sort of disenfranchising for me to like even want to engage when I feel like everything's just being parroted. A lot of people don't really want to have an intellectual discussion about these issues in the way that you would want and hope to. So allsides.com. Thank you, Roy. Check that out. I have 5 minutes here. Let's see what Jill said. For those who are left-leaning, there tends to be an overarching assumption that right-leaning people are unintelligent. Conversely, right-leaning people tend to assume that left-leaning people are snowflakes, indoctrinating wokeness. How do you recommend we bridge the gap between more extreme ends of the spectrum? I mean, I'm trying to do it now. And you know what's funny? I did a dry run of this presentation with my spouse, and as I mentioned, she's very liberal. She had a very strong reaction to this presentation. She got kind of upset because she's like, it was like I was telling her she has to be friends with more conservative people, and she got almost emotional about this. And it was very informative to me, because yeah, like and one of the things we talked about is I said to her, like, you know, the way you think about someone that's conservative, like the way you characterize them, think about the way they characterize you. They say that we just want to open the borders and let anyone in, and that we want all women to have as many abortions as possible. Like that's obviously not an accurate characterization about us. So why are we making these characterizations about them that probably don't stick? So I think putting yourself in other people's shoes is a good starting point in having empathy. All right, let's keep going here. This chat's heating up. I love it. What about blatant lies or alternative facts? What do you do in a situation? I know that. Yeah, that one gets me upset too. I mean, I think that I don't have enough time to cover that one. That's a great point. But yeah, allsides.com, bias checker. When you're trying to have a normal conversation, yeah, I mean, these are all great questions, and I really appreciate everyone coming to check this out. We're running a little low on time, but I hope this was helpful. We have like 50 people in here. This is amazing. Thank you so much for coming, all of you. I'm looking at the names. I recognize a lot of you. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so on this note, just remember, like, keep peace and love in your heart. Please don't repeat the characterizations that you see on the news stations about other people. If you look at like CNN and Fox, their main media strategy is to write negative stories about the other party and create terrible characterizations. Get away from that. Like, break free of the chains of all this stuff. Challenge yourself. Be friends with people with different political views, and challenge yourself to have like a conversation about it that's respectful, and express curiosity about the person. Like, figure out like, how did they come and believe this, and you know, keep your outrage down and all that. And yeah, no fighting at the dinner table. Keep love in your heart. Maintain these friendships with loved ones. They generally have a lot of value in your life. And yeah, everyone have a fantastic day. And thank you to CEO Tony Stubblebine for this, and to Medium. Love all of you. This is great. And I'll see you on the flip side. Peace.